All right, the book of Nahum, verse 1 says, the burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Different word, but you remember Amos's name meant burden bearer. And we noted that oftentimes the oracles, the prophecies, are referred to as burdens. It is a burden that is being borne by the prophet and, of course, a burden upon the nation being prophesied against oftentimes. So this is the burden against Nineveh, much like Obadiah was about who? Remember that? Obadiah was about Edom, right? So it wasn't about Israel, it wasn't about Judah. It was about Edom. Now, Israel and Judah are mentioned, obviously, in these, but it's not really about them, though it's written for them. And that's something I think we learn as well. This is in the Hebrew Scriptures. This was written about Nineveh, and it was written, of course, in part for the children of Israel. And Obadiah and Nahum are unique in that way. Let's get into the questions to start off. Number one asks the question, what is the meaning of the name Nahum?
Reassurance, consolation.
Reassurance and consolation, comfort, right? How do you make sense of that? Notice in chapter 3 and verse 7, speaking of Assyria, Nineveh being the capital of Assyria, it shall come to pass that all who look upon you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Who shall I seek comforters for you? Or where shall I seek comforters for you? So how does it make sense that Nahum's name is about comfort? I realize that like Jonah means a dove. And, sometimes it doesn't directly relate. I think it does here though. But how would it relate?
There would be comfort knowing that Assyria would get their reward.
Sure. Who would receive comfort from that? Everyone. I mean, especially God's people, but at the end of the book, it says, all who hear news of you, verse 19 of chapter 3, will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has your wickedness, not your wickedness, passed continually? They were awful. Everyone hated them. Everyone feared them. Any of their allies were allies because they feared them. And that's just how it was. Assyria is notorious for that. So Nahum's name meaning comfort is not comfort for them. It's comfort for the people of God and for everyone else as well. It says that he is an Elkoshite, which means a native of Elkish. It's disputed about where that is. I don't know that anyone knows for sure. But according to Strong's lexicon, he says that word means God the ensnarer. And I believe that might have some legitimacy to this as well. God has ensnared them in their own ways. That's oftentimes how you see all of these nations fall, including Judah and Israel. They fall by their own wisdom. They fall by their own wickedness. I mean, that's what he's going to say in chapter 3, verse 4. Because of the multitude of harlotries and the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries. The because of follows their destruction. This is happening because of this. You did it to yourselves. And so God ensnares them in their own ways. And He'll scatter them through Babylon. But God is certainly doing this. What is the approximate time range of the book of Nahum? That's question number 3. And what are the indicators of that for us?
650 to 615 BC.
Okay.
Time frame.
Sure. And so now you have the prophecy of the fall of Assyria, which would indicate this is happening before then, right? And so Assyria falls in 612. And then you have in chapter 3 an Egyptian city, Nahum, which is a city that fell by the hands of Assyria. He reflects back on that and says, do you think you're better than them? So it's in between them. So it's considered 650 to 615. Anything on that? You have a question, I probably don't have an answer. That's how I am with dates. It seems about logical that it's got to be after that and before the fall fall of Assyria. So what is the message of the book of Nahum? What are some things that you could come up with? That's question 4. What's the overall theme? Overthrow of Nineveh, right? The burden against Nineveh, right? So what are maybe some sub-themes to that we can find? Yeah, God's goodness and vengeance. What does that sound like? Romans 11, the goodness and severity of God, right? Has he been good to Israel? Absolutely. Will he be good to the Israelites who reject his son? No. Consider the goodness and severity of God. Is he good to all nations? Absolutely. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. Will he let just nations do whatever they want and amass their immoralities and idolatries? No. He's going to deal with that. So the goodness and severity of God, right? What else? Yes, ma'am.
God is long-suffering, but there's a point for that.
Excellent point. Yeah, God is long-suffering. But long-suffering doesn't mean eternal suffering, right? He's patient. He bears under the rebellion and obstinacy of people and nations, but he doesn't forever. Think about Nineveh. Where else did we read about Nineveh so far as we studied through the minor prophets? Jonah, right? And we read about Jonah being sent to spare Nineveh, preach repentance to them, and they repented, right? We also started off with seeing that the wickedness that came up before Jehovah from Nineveh is a general word that is raw, which has reference to not just moral wickedness, but also oftentimes is used for just calamity and adversity. And we read in Amos and Hosea and other minor prophets already, it's throughout the entirety of the Bible and in the Pentateuch with regard to the promises of Jehovah, the blessings and the cursings that they can count on, that if you disobey me, I'm going to send plagues, I'm going to send locusts, I'm going to send death and destruction, and all of these things are so that you'll turn back to me. And so even that happens among foreign nations. Nineveh went through a lot of hard times, and it kind of made them ripe for not only destruction, but also responding to the truth. And that's what happened in Jonah. And then some 100+ years later, they're right back in it, and it's no more. I've dealt with you long enough, right? So the long suffering, but that's not forever. Great point. Anything else? Yes, sir. Yeah.
You know, back during the kings were good king, bad king, good king.
Yeah.
They just weren't, sure, it's marvelous that you're doing right, but you need to spread that heritage
Definitely.
on.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And what do those accounts usually start with? They did good, like their father David. They followed their ancestors that were doing things that were faithful, or they did not. They followed the path of Jeroboam. So you've got that contrast. We need to teach our children and teach them to teach others, and it's passed down through generations. We'll talk a little bit about that in our sermon next. So it needs to be taught. It can't just be taken for granted. It needs to be passed on. Also, you have the sovereignty of God in all of this, right? God has his hand in this. In chapter 1 of Nahum, in verse 6, it asks the question, who can stand before his indignation? This isn't about Babylon being the big dude on campus now, even though that's true historically. It's about Jehovah. He rules in the kingdoms of men. Notice in verse 14 of chapter 1, your name shall be perpetuated no longer. I'm going to put you in the dirt, is what he says. I'm digging your grave. And then what's interesting is it tells us in verse 8 of chapter 1 that with an overflowing flood, he will make an utter end of its place. That's interesting because, while that's language used in regard to conquest and overtaking of nations and cities. In Isaiah chapter 10, or rather chapter 8, the people are, Isaiah's prophesying, and he's talking about Assyria at this point. And it said they would not trust in the waters of Shiloah, Isaiah 8 and verse 7. And so the Lord will bring over them the waters of the river, the strong and mighty waters, the river of the king of Assyria and all his glory will go up over his channels and over all his banks, pass through Judah, overflow and pass over and reach up to the neck. And so Assyria was described as this flood that's just covering everyone and suffocating them and drowning them and killing them. And now they're going to be flooded. And the flood is Jehovah. And so it just is language that confirms to me God is doing this. One of their greatest sins that leads to all other sins is they were not those who acknowledge God's sovereignty. In Isaiah 10, again, Assyria is being discussed, and God is saying, look, I'm using Assyria to chasten my people, but he doesn't think that way. He thinks it's all in his power and his might. He's doing this. He's accomplishing this. He's gaining this. It's his power. And essentially the text goes on to say, I'll show him who's in control. The axe doesn't boast against the one who holds it and wields it. It doesn't work that way. And so not recognizing God's sovereignty led to the ultimate demise. Homer Haley in his commentary points this out too, that Nahum's book is not about the reporting of personal glee over the fall of Nineveh, expressing the narrow hatred and prejudice of a single individual, kind of like Jonah's attitude, right? But it is the fervent expression of the outraged conscience of mankind. Everyone was afflicted by Assyria. Everyone experienced their injustice and their degree of depravity and immorality. And everyone is fed up with it. And God sees everyone suffering and delivers them from this evil people. Some historical background. The book mentions some of the kings, so write those down. I hope you got them. I'm not even going to try to pronounce all of them. Several of them are found in the Bible, of course. They were extremely effective militarily. Still top of the list with the history of nations. Here is an excerpt from some of the records of one of the Assyrian kings, Ashurnasirpal II. And this just kind of shows, there's a quote from the book too about the barbaric and violent nature of their conquests. He says, as he boasts, I built a pillar over against the city gate, and I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. I impaled upon the pillar on stakes, and others I bound to stakes around the pillar. I cut the limbs off the officers who had rebelled. Many captives from among them I burned with fire, and many I took as living captives. From some I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. Of many I put out their eyes. Why? Just cruelty. And I think a very ungodly tactic. War crimes and such. Shock and awe. Psychological warfare was a big part of Assyria, and that's a big part of why God's wrath came against them. Comments, questions on the introductory material? All right, we'll get into the text. So the burden of the Lord against Nineveh. It tells us in verse 2, God is jealous, and the Lord avenges and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries. He reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. So a lot of the things we just talked about in regard to the theme of the book and what we can learn. It's interesting in verses 2 and 3, God's name is found 5 times. And I think that's for emphasis. Yahweh, found 5 times. This is who Yahweh is. And this is how he's been with you, Nineveh. But also, he's not just long-suffering. He's not just slow to anger. But he's great in power, and he avenges, and he's jealous. So if you don't get in line, this is what happens. This is his character. We can't just make God one-dimensional. That's not who he is. He is a God of grace and mercy, but also truth and justice. And if we don't fall in line with his truth and uphold his justice, then we don't receive his grace and mercy. That's just how it is. Think about that. The skeptic often brings up how harsh God is and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, just live in a society where people who murder other people don't receive any kind of penalty. You want to be a part of that? How is that fair to the people that they're murdering and the people that they're tormenting with that fear? Justice has to be upheld. There has to be consequences. But notice he says he's jealous. That sounds a lot like in the Ten Commandments. Don't bow down to other gods. Don't make any other images because I'm a jealous God. Why would he tell Assyria that, though? He's jealous. Assyria is not his people. Or, how do we make sense of that? It makes sense to me when he's telling Judah or Israel, hey, get your act together. I'm jealous and you're my people, so don't go after other gods. But why say that in a burden against Nineveh?
Still the God of all nations.
Yeah. When he says I'm jealous, and that immediately draws our attention to the passage of the Ten Commandments, talking about serving other gods and bowing down to molded images, that's true for every nation. It's not just Israel that shouldn't be committing idolatry. Every nation is supposed to serve the one and only true God. And when they bow down to images, it's an affront to him. And he's jealous, and he's not going to just let that happen. And that's the thing even with world religions today. We say, oh, why don't we just be tolerant, we as a society? Why don't we just leave them alone? Does God say that that's how we... God says, like Paul went into Athens and says, look, I see you're very religious, but you're very wrong. And God's not going to put up with this. We got to tell people. God's a jealous God. And he'll avenge. He'll take vengeance on his adversaries. But it says he's slow to anger. It's not like he flies off the handle. God's not capricious. He doesn't act randomly. He's given them time. And now it's done. What do we read about in the New Testament about that? Where's the passage that comes to mind? I mean, there's many, but... Yes, sir.
Rendering vengeance on those that obey not the gospel.
Yeah, 2 Thessalonians 1. Yeah, how long did they have to obey the gospel? I don't know, but God does, and he's never going to send anyone to hell in an unjust way. They always had time. He's going to be perfect in his judgment. People that didn't obey the gospel cannot tell God, well, I didn't get a chance. I never had a chance to hear it. That's not going to be true. God gives them a chance. 2 Peter 3, remember? 1 day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as 1 day. He's not slack concerning his promise. He's long-suffering. He doesn't will that anyone should perish, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. It will come. And so he's slow to angering, but he's great in power, and he's not going to quit the wicked. That doesn't mean he doesn't forgive. It means that if you're going to stay in your wickedness, I'm not just going to sweep it under the rug. That's what it's saying. He provides a way to be acquitted, to be forgiven, to be just and righteous before him. But it's not just him saying, okay, I'll just forget about it. That's not how it works. He forgets our lawless deeds and our sins are remembered no more by virtue of the powerful blood of Christ that washes them away and atones for them, right? Any comments, questions on that? Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, we all understand this, but I feel like sometimes people try to make it negative that God is jealous. They're like, I don't want to serve a jealous God or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a justified, righteous jealousy.
Yeah.
So that was it.
Yeah, it's his right. He created. It's like, I'm not going to, I don't know what a parallel to that would be. I'm not going to create something and then it runs off and not get upset about that. God created. It's his prerogative. He gets to choose, that he's going to create, why he's going to create, who's going to be created, and what they're for. And he's going to be jealous. And it's just like in a marriage. I mean, who doesn't realize the legitimacy and the just nature of jealousy in marriage? I'm jealous for my wife, and my wife is jealous for me. She belongs to me, and I belong to her, nobody else. Do I have a right to feel that way? Certainly. Absolutely. God has a right to feel that way as well. We studied about that in Hosea. The people belong to him, but also the whole world is his, and you better acknowledge him. And this is what happens if you don't. So he goes on to describe this terrible anger of the Lord in very figurative ways, of course, but he speaks about how he's in the whirlwind and the storm. The clouds are the dust of his feet. So it shows how big he is, but also like all these storms and stuff, it's like walking through the dirt and stirring up dust. That's what the storms are. It's God's activity that led to this. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry and dries up the river. He mentions Bashan and Carmel and then Lebanon, 3 very lush places known for their vegetation. God can dry up in an instant because the only reason they are lush is because of the rain that God sends. And if he decides to stop it, it's going to stop. The mountains quake, the hills melt, the earth heaves at his presence, the world and all who dwell in it. Nobody can stand before his indignation. That's the answer to the question in verse 6. Who can endure the fierceness of his anger? No one. His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. So just a number of vivid ways to show how terrible it is to come up against the Lord. And so notice the two sides again mentioned in verses 7 and 8. He is good. Yahweh is a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who trust in him. But with an overflowing flood, he will make an utter end of its place, and darkness will pursue his enemies. Remember 1 Peter 3, when it says, don't be afraid of these people who will harm you if you become followers of what is good. It says, sanctify the Lord God in your heart and be ready to give an answer. Well, that whole section quotes and alludes to passages or verses from Isaiah, where Isaiah is told, don't fear the people, let Jehovah be your fear, and he will be your sanctuary. But he's a stumbling block and a stone of offense for those who don't put their trust in him. That's what he's saying here. If you trust me, nothing can happen to you. I'll be with you. But if you don't trust me and you are opposed to me, you're not going to be able to withstand this at all. So notice how that comes out in verse 9. I know we're going through this, but in verse 9, he gets to Assyria specifically and shows how they're going to be destroyed. And why? See, they're not innocent. It's not like, well, we'll serve our gods and we'll do what our gods tell us to do. And, what's it to do with you? Like, why are you getting in our business? That's not how it works. In all of their conquering and all of their idolatry and all of their sorcery and in all of their immorality, they're against the Lord. And that's what he says. What do you conspire against Yahweh, against the Lord? He will make an utter end of it. Affliction will not rise up for a second time. Verse 11, he says, from you comes forth one who plots evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor, or a counselor of Belial, the wicked one. An epithet that would be given to Satan later on. All your ways, all your schemes, when you decide to try to, let's say, he'll talk about their harlotry and their deceptiveness later. So you approach this small city and you strong arm them and you say, listen, we'll be good if you pay me tribute. And it's a tribute that will completely destroy their economy. But I'll do you good if you pay me tribute. And then you destroy them anyway. Even when they say, okay, I'll pay. You didn't just do that against them. You did that against the Lord. You conspired against the Lord. You waged war against the Lord. You had wicked counsel against the Lord. Because those people belong to him too. And so nothing is done in a vacuum, is essentially what we learned here. So in verse 10, notice he says, while tangled like thorns and while drunken like drunkards, they shall be devoured like stubble fully dry. Evidently, I don't know because I don't know Hebrew, but evidently the Hebrew is difficult here. But a hedge of thorns was used for protection. But he's saying you're tangled up in it. And then it says that you're drunk like drunkards. And so that was a luxury that leads to destruction. But also throughout Israel's history, plenty of places this is applied to Israel themselves, their wisdom is considered as being drunk and inebriated. And if you want to trust in your wisdom and not in God's wisdom, God will allow that to happen, and it will be your demise. And kind of that's what we see here. You're making plans, you're taking counsel, you're hedged up, with thorns, and you think you're protected, but all the things that you trust in are actually going to be your downfall. And that's kind of how God operates, isn't it? Anything on that? Yes, sir.
We look at sin at times, and maybe sometimes individually we don't realize that sin is a self-infliction.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what we're talking about and seeing here, and what he's trying to get us to understand is that they have done this to themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. When there's a ruler, especially one who is all-knowing and all-seeing and all-powerful, and what we do is not done in a vacuum, if it goes against his wishes, against his laws, you'd better believe it's going to lead to consequences and destruction. You cannot do evil and get away with it. Even in time where it might seem you are getting away with it, the Bible talks about how you're amassing wrath and tribulation in the day of wrath. There's a day of wrath coming. And that's what all of these days of the Lord and destructions, they point to the one true day of the Lord at the end of time, when all will be raised and judged and the world will be dissolved and there will be a new order set up by the Lord. And we need to realize that. And we should try to make those connections kind of before doing something and making a decision. See where it goes. See what the Bible says about it, where it goes. We can avoid a lot of harm from that as well. So now he addresses his people in verse 12. Though they are safe and likewise many, yet in this manner they will be cut down when he passes through. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. For now I will break off his yoke from you and burst your bonds apart. Would God's people be victims of Assyria? Absolutely. Israel taken into captivity. And then Judah, 46 cities, Sennacherib boasts he took. Got all the way up to the neck, to Jerusalem. Certainly they suffered. Even Judah did. But God would break their yoke from them. Verse 14, the Lord has given a command concerning you. Now he turns back to Nineveh, Assyria. Your name shall be perpetuated no longer. Out of the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and molded image. I will dig your grave, for you are vile. And so this nation is going to be completely cut off. Interestingly enough, after Babylon besieged and decimated and razed Assyria, archaeologists and scholars didn't know where Assyria was until, I believe it was the 19th century, when archaeologists discovered where Assyria was, under a heap of ruins, obviously. So they were completely wiped off the map. People wouldn't even be able to find them. Notice the connection of that to idolatry. You've been doing all of this in respect and service of your gods. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to completely wipe them out. He says that you are vile. The Hebrew word for vile actually means light. Psalm 62 and verse 9 says, men of low degree are only vanity, and men of rank are a lie. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than breath. And so their weight in the balances, they're light, they're vile, they're going to be destroyed. Someone read verse 15. Please, chapter 1.
Behold on the mountains the feet of him who brings good tidings, who proclaims peace. O Judah, keep your appointed feast, perform your vows, for the wicked one shall no more pass through you. He is utterly cut off.
Thank you. What does that sound like, that first part? Romans 10 quotes it. Isaiah 52, where you might disagree, but the feet of those who preach the gospel, they're beautiful. That's what the text says, okay? But that's where it comes from. He's borrowing that same kind of language. The difference is the beautiful tidings, the glad tidings, the wonderful news is not the gospel here. It's Assyria has fallen. That's how bad it was. That's the gospel now, is that Assyria has fallen. But I think it also, while maybe not directly, at least in our mind, should foreshadow the good news, because while it's good news, it's also good news that has some darkness to it in the sense of enemies being destroyed, wickedness falling. And so one of the reasons we rejoice with the gospel is that Satan is thrown down. Satan is, defeated, and that's a good thing. So what has God called them to? Keep your appointed feast, perform your vows. So be faithful to me. Respond to this by turning to me, and that's obviously always the call. Chapter 2, yes, sir.
I want to revert back to the importance of patience and long suffering, where if you're ever around people that are impatient, it's always chaos.
Yeah.
They feel like there has to be an answer, and it has to be solved right then, and they do that, and it's typically the wrong answer, and then a day later they're having to apologize or whatever it might be. So, we have to be patient and long-suffering, But we also have to realize back to the day is 1,000 and 1,000 years is a day. We don't have 100 years. You know, so we have to be patient and long-suffering to our lifetime's timeline, not God's, because He's been around 1,000 years. So we may need a few days, a few weeks, a few months, but things have to still be done.
Yeah.
So we can't extend it on to just count it down as patience and long-suffering when we're not doing what's right.
That's a good point. Yeah, God says He's long-suffering, we should be too, and He was long-suffering to this nation for hundreds of years, so I don't have to worry about that. Let the next generation worry about it. It doesn't work that way. And God knows, and I think we know when we do that. Sometimes it's legit, sometimes it's an excuse. We can't have it as an excuse to be negligent and put things off. That's a great point. So, chapter 2 begins this description of the destruction of Nineveh. Chapter 3, we'll talk about it too. It's interesting, though, a picture is painted. So look at verse 1. He who scatters, that's a reference to the one who's going to take Assyria. God's at back of that, but it's the Babylonians. He who scatters has come up before your face. So what do? Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily. So think about that. How were cities taken back then? What was the method? Siege. They were sieged, right? So surrounded. So you have the city and the city walls. And you got the suburbs. And you've got this enemy coming, and you're seeing your people killed and houses burned, and you're seeing that from the walls, and you're like, we better get things together. They're about to be here. Then in verse 5, he remembers his nobles. They stumble in their walk. They make haste to her walls, and the defense is prepared. We're getting ready for this. We know that they're coming. The gates are open, and the palace is dissolved. And it is decreed she, that is Assyria, will be led captive. She shall be brought up. Her maidservant shall lead her out as the voice of doves beating their breasts. Look at chapter 3 and verse 18. Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Your nobles rest in the dust. Your people are scattered on the mountains. No one gathers them. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe. It kind of paints that whole picture of the Oriental siege. One writer puts it, the siege of those in the ancient Near East and how they took cities. And that's basically what we read throughout the rest of the book, with obviously details in there about other things. So that's what we have here. Verse 2, the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob. That would be ultimately their relationship with God, like the excellence of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches. So Assyria did that to them, and God's going to rectify that wrong. And ultimately that would look forward to the provision of His true remnant being there as well. Verses 3 through 4 describes the Babylonian armies and how hopefully you read this before class, but just you read it and it's terrifying. I mean, I don't know what I would do if I'm standing on the walls of my city and I'm seeing all of them just advance toward me. It's terrifying. Verse 8, Nineveh of old was like a pool of water, so an oasis where people gathered, but now they flee away. People might say, halt, halt, that is, stay and defend the city, but no one turns back. They're going to go. They know what's coming. And their silver and gold will be taken, shall be empty and desolate and waste. Then in verse 11 of chapter 2, they're described as the kings of the beasts that are lions. And so he says, where is the dwelling of the lions and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion walked and the lioness and lion's cub, and no one made them afraid? The lion tore in pieces enough for his cubs, killed for his lionesses, filled his caves with prey and his dens with flesh. So again, Assyria is big, Nineveh, a big city, the capital city. People know where it is and who they are, and they're fierce like lions. I mean, they're the kings of the world right now. They're the world empire right now. But after Babylon's finished with you, people aren't even going to know where Assyria is. I mean, that's how bad it got. Like I mentioned, people didn't even know where it was until fairly recently throughout history. And so they would feed on other nations and cities and kingdoms to bring back wealth and slaves and captives for their people, providing for their people. Notice though in verse 12, you didn't just provide enough, but you filled your caves with prey. You hoarded it. You just kept doing it. So Assyria, as bad as it might be to, okay, we want some more stuff and our people need things, so we're going to murder a bunch of people to take what they have and then it'll provide for our people's needs. That would have been bad enough. But even when they had enough, they just kept going. They kept going. And they kept taking people's stuff and lands and their lives. And so he says, I am against you, verse 13. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messenger shall be heard no more. So all those people you sent out with a message of pay tribute and we'll avoid destroying you, nobody's going to hear that anymore, because you are going to be wiped off the face of the earth. Chapter 3 points out a lot of that as well. Verse 1 speaks about them as a city of bloodshed, of lies and robbery, of making everyone a victim, and always having a victim in their teeth. Verse 4, harlotry, seductive harlot, mistress, and sorceries, selling nations through her harlotries, and families through her sorceries. And I think that in addition to just idolatry, the harlotry has to do with deceptiveness. Just like Proverbs talks about the harlot. She promises pleasure. She promises fulfillment. And a man by her is reduced to a crust of bread. She kills those that go into her. And so they were deceptive. They promised peace. They promised fulfillment to these nations. And then they just wiped them out. And he says that's why this is happening to you, verses 2 and 3. All this noise of war and galloping horses and bodies that are so great and countless that you stumble over those corpses. Complete decimation. In verses 5 through 7, again, the Lord is at the back of this. He is against them. He'll bring them shame, lifting their skirts over their face and showing the nations their nakedness. Remember Isaiah 47 talking about Babylon and the veil taken off and the skirt removed and passing through the rivers and grinding mill. It's this royal woman that is reduced to slavery. And that's kind of the idea. Your honor is reduced and taken away. You're made abominable. You're vile. And you're made a spectacle. And people won't even want to look at you anymore. No one's going to even comfort you because of what you've done to everyone else. Then he brings up what we mentioned in the introduction. This Egyptian city of Nahum, or as also is known by another name. And he basically says, look, you remember in your history that you went up against Nahum and showed no mercy, and they could not withstand you. And that was despite their physical protection, that they were by the river, water surrounded her, whose wall was the sea, her political protection. Ethiopia and Egypt, Put and Luban were your helpers. And even though they had all that help, they couldn't withstand you. Remember that? Remember how good you felt? Remember how powerful you felt? Are you better than them? That's what he's saying. It's like, the bully has made the victim now. And she was carried away captive. Verse 11, you will be drunk, will be hidden. You will also seek refuge from the enemy. It's coming for you and you can't do anything about it. You're no better than them. You're going to be destroyed just like them. He says the strongholds you have in verse 12, they're just like fig trees that people are going to eat from. I mean, it's not going to help you. It's not going to fortify you. They're just going to take it, and they're going to take you with it. Your people, verse 13, are women. And I think what he's saying is like all your valiant men of war, just weak and feeble, they're not going to be able to deliver you. And fires will devour the bars of your gates. So all your fortification, it's not going to be anything. Then, again, he sarcastically encourages them, prepare, gather water for the siege, bind up the breaches and the walls and make yourself like many and defend your city. And it's not going to work. And then at the end of verse 19 shows us just how bad Assyria was. All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually. People will be shouting for joy when you die because of how horrible you've been. And that's God's justice. We'll pick up with Habakkuk, Lord willing, on Wednesday.